Tuesday, February 10th, 2026, AGNDD Intelli Report topic. Ben Shapiro is waging battle inside the MAGA movement. Please pardon any visual and informational inaccuracies in this partially AI-generated article-based video. The New Yorker interview. Ben Shapiro is waging battle inside the MAGA movement. The conservative commentator on the anti-Semitism in MAGA media and why he condemns President Trump as corrupt yet sticks with him. By David Remnick, February 9, 2026. Ben Shapiro is a conservative provocateur. Ever since he was a teenager at UCLA writing op-eds for the Daily Bruin, he has shown a penchant for the rhetorical grenade. Women who have abortions are baby killers. Western civilization is superior to other civilizations. Israelis like to build, he tweeted in 2010. Arabs like to bomb crap and live in open sewage. This is not a difficult issue. Settlements rock. Shapiro is now 42, and his rhetoric has mellowed only somewhat. On college campuses and on his podcast, The Ben Shapiro Show, he has been an advocate for the Trump presidency, even though he refused to vote for him in 2016 and allows that the president is, as we discuss here, financially corrupt and morally wanting. Earlier this week, I spoke with Shapiro for the New Yorker Radio Hour, mainly about the battles within the MAGA movement in which he is currently engaged. Recently, Shapiro has gone into attack mode against some of his fellow MAGA media stars, including Tucker Carlson, for their indulgence, if not outright support, of anti-Semites like Nick Fuentes. It is a drama that has implications not only for the Trump era, but for what might follow. J.D. Vance, for one, has refused to join Shapiro in rebuking Carlson. Our conversation has been edited for clarity and length. You worked at Breitbart, which was an publication of the MAGA movement. You were acquainted with Steve Bannon and all kinds of people. When you look back on your Breitbart days, what do you think was positive about that time? And what do you look back on with some regret? I had worked at Talk Radio Network, which was the syndicator for Michael Savage and Laura Ingraham, and then I ended up being hired by Andrew. I'd known Andrew since I was at UCLA. Andrew Breitbart, the founder of the publication, who died in his 40s. Yeah, he was very young. I'd known Andrew for about 10 years. He came to me and said, "Will you come on board and join Breitbart?" It was the middle of the 2012 election cycle, and he died 3-4 weeks after I'd signed on. Suddenly, the leadership structure was completely upended, because Andrew had been sort of a one-man band. He was the person from whom all thoughts sort of sprang, in terms of the direction of the site. The leadership structure changed pretty dramatically. Steve Bannon, who'd been kind of hanging around on the fringes of the Breitbart universe, he'd been making a documentary about Andrew, was brought in by Larry Soloff, who was Andrew's business partner, to essentially be president of Breitbart. Did you have problems with Steve Bannon and the like and their treatment of rhetoric and truth or non-truth and conspiracy theory when you first encountered it? It was never sort of a bed of roses with Steve Bannon. There are a lot of people in the Breitbart infrastructure who are not fond of Steve, or the way that he was running things, making editorial decisions and the like. I think that there were some wonderful things. But how did you assess what Steve Bannon wanted in this world? He wasn't just a conservative. He was and remains a kind of MAGA warrior who's willing to say and do what is necessary to push that battle forward. And I'm being gentle about this. Yeah, I mean, if you look at Breitbart's coverage circa, say, 2012 or 2013, those were fairly mainstream conservative talking points. It was certainly a mainstream conservative website at that time. I think by the time we hit 2015, 2016, things had started to evolve, especially because of the rise of President Trump. I was not a supporter of President Trump in the 2015 to 2016 election cycle. I was much more supportive of Ted Cruz in the primaries, and then in the general election I actually didn't vote because I was unhappy with both candidates. Obviously, after that, President Trump did many things that, as a conservative, I like. He's certainly a non-ideological figure, which is why so many people try to sort of claim that MAGA is a part of their movement. You have Reagan conservatives who will say that MAGA is Reagan conservatism. You'll have national populists who say that it's national populist. Trump is none of those things. Trump is Trump, and he has instincts. Which means what to you, Ben? Trump is Trump means what? His instincts are sort of naturally those of a 1975 conservative. That means that he likes a strong America on the world stage, but tempered by a sort of hard-nosed realism about non-interventionism. When it comes to domestic policy, he has a weird mix of not liking the government to be involved in everything, but also wanting to use the government in ways that I don't particularly approve of. He seems to be more about, what is the solution at hand? Will I try it? And then, if it doesn't work, then he pulls out of it. People have termed that taco. Trump always chickens out. I don't think that's right. I think that President Trump is a person who is willing to try different things and then will shift on a dime if he thinks those things aren't working. Do you think Trump is honest? In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just a couple of days ago describing the fishy investments from Abu Dhabi into the Trump family. Our reporter, David Kirkpatrick, who's extremely conservative in his calculations, has said that the Trump family has enriched itself to the tune of $4 billion since taking office again in 2024. Does this concern you at all? Of course, I've been calling this out since, I think, before pretty much anybody else. I mean, early on in the Trump administration, when World Liberty Financial was pretty clearly making a fair bit of money over in the Middle East, I raised red flags on my show consistently about how I thought this was wrong. If the name were Biden instead of Trump, people would be screaming bloody murder. And this was not beneficial to President Trump's agenda either. So, sure, that concerns me. Not beneficial to his agenda or corrupt? I mean, both, obviously. I do think that if you are taking what I perceive to be digital assets that are not particularly worthwhile, and then you have people who are politically interested in investing massive amounts of money into those things, that is not a good thing. You voted for him the second time? I voted for him in 2020, and then I campaigned for him in 2024. Why? Because it was now a binary choice between Trump and Kamala Harris, and I liked a lot of what he did during his first administration. I felt the guardrails would largely hold, which I believe they have, with regard to President Trump. I know many on the left believe they've not, but what I would say is that, you believe the guardrails have held this time? Yes, I'm hard-pressed to see. Help me on that, Ben. The Trump administration has not bucked the judiciary by saying that if an appellate court or the Supreme Court rules in a particular way, it will still go ahead and do whatever it is it wants to do. The president does cite legal authority for the things that he's doing. So, you're confident that the Justice Department will pursue corruption charges against the Trump family? No, I'm confident that the president will likely pardon himself and his children in the same way that Joe Biden did on his way out. Laughs. You're laughing, but that's radically corrupt, is it not? I think that it was radically corrupt when the DOJ did not pursue, with alacrity, a lot of the issues surrounding the Biden family too. So the answer is yes, and it applies to all parties. What I hear from the left is a constant drumbeat of accusations about President Trump, to which I acquiesce in part, but I find them utterly unconcerned with the same sorts of issues arising on their side of the aisle. They see President Trump as the person who's constantly violating the standard, the person who's constantly setting the new standard, the person who is responsible for the death of American politics or the decay of American politics. And, as I've said publicly before, I think President Trump stumbled on the prone body of American politics and said, "This is a dead body. I see him much more as a coroner than as the murderer." Now, that doesn't mean that there's not some of both, meaning that I think things can get worse under President Trump than they were heretofore, and I'm not going to deny that he's done things that I think are bad and wrong. I was very critical of his rhetoric, for example, between the election of 2020 and January 6th. But I do think that... But do you not see any of these things as disqualifying in a moral political sense? January 6th, for example. I don't know what disqualifying means in the sense that I did not support him in the primaries. That he would lose your faith and vote and support forever. Well, I mean, the only way to lose my faith and support and vote forever would be for there to be an alternative that I find superior to him. This is the problem when you're making voting decisions. Would I want Donald Trump marrying into my family? Probably not. The problem is that once you say that the candidate is disqualified, then you either have to sit out the election, which I did in 2016, and then whatever damage President Trump had, I thought, done by being elected in 2016, he did a bunch of things I liked between 2016 and 2020, and then I did not like what he did with regard to the election of 2020 and the falsehoods that he told about winning that election. And then I didn't support him in the primaries, and then he ended up winning the nomination. He was running against Kamala Harris. So I can either sit out the election again, which doesn't really achieve the... So what you're saying is that the potential of Kamala Harris, in your view, politically, outweighs the support for what, in essence, was an insurrection on Capitol Hill. That's hard for me to say the least. I think that that's a pretty poor way of putting it. That's not the way that we assess candidates in the real world. The way that we assess candidates in the real world is, who is more likely to perform the agenda that I see as important versus who is more likely to inhibit that agenda? And so I can fully disapprove of what happened on January 6th and think it was quite terrible and still acknowledge that Donald Trump as president, from 2017 to 2021, did a better job than Joe Biden did. There are many people in the Republican Party who consider themselves never Trumpers. Not a decisive number, certainly, but there are a number of people who see his moral transgressions as so serious that they make a very different calculation than you do, electorally. I mean, sure, and they're entitled to that calculation. The question to me is always one of iteration. Voting is one decision, but just because you vote for someone doesn't mean that you support everything that they do. Ben, what initially attracted you to conservatism? I grew up in a household with two Reagan Republicans. My parents are pretty conservative. The basic idea that lies behind a good conservatism, I think, is personal responsibility, duty, a requirement that you do the right thing, a basic moral stance about how individuals should act in a free country. And I think that's still largely what drives my conservatism today. A kind of personal rectitude. Yes. Do you find that that's antithetical to liberalism? It doesn't have to be, but I think that liberalism very often is a way of shielding people from the consequences of their own decisions, or an attempt to shift individual responsibility onto systems in a way that is frequently unjustified. The difference between right and left, in my definition of it, is that the right acknowledges that when people fail because human nature is fallible, very often that is your own responsibility. And the best way to actually treat that problem is to self-correct. And the left, because they have, I think, a rosier view of what human nature is, tends to attribute to systems that which I think more properly lies in responsibility with the individual. How much did religion influence your becoming a conservative? You were raised an Orthodox Jew. I think you're still a practicing Orthodox Jew, am I correct? Yes, that's right. We became Orthodox when I was 11. So I remember eating at Kentucky Fried Chicken, but I was fairly young when we became Orthodox. My mom and dad started going to a synagogue down in Venice Beach, actually, and they were very taken with the rabbi, and I think that they got more and more interested in that. They decided that they wanted to send me to a Jewish day school, and so I'd go to the Jewish day school. It was an Orthodox school, and I'd come home and say, Mom and Dad, I don't understand why we're doing X, Y, and Z when at school they're teaching me that this is what we're supposed to be doing. And my parents were, I think, smart enough to see the inherent conflict, and instead of saying, your school is doing it wrong, or you're doing it wrong, or they're teaching the wrong thing, they said, well, we're probably doing it wrong, and so probably we need to actually rectify that breach. Let's talk about the debate that you're having inside MAGA. You're at the center of a fight, a feud, that's developing in the conservative movement, and it has to do with anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories related to anti-Semitism. Not long after Charlie Kirk died, you spoke at the Turning Point USA conference, America Fest, and you called out Candace Owens and attendees like Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson. These are very influential figures now on the right and the media of the MAGA movement. Talk to me a little bit about this divide, how it's developed, and what it's done to your relationships inside the MAGA movement. First of all, as people may suspect, I'm not particularly interested in my personal relationships with others in the political sphere. I have a family that's very tight-knit. I have 4 children going on 5. I have a dog. I have plenty of things going on in my social calendar, and I don't see it as particularly important to hang out with people who are in sort of the same career milieu. There were 2 speeches that I gave back-to-back. One was a speech that I gave at the Heritage Foundation the night before, and one was the TPUSA speech that I gave that night. The Heritage Foundation speech was specifically directed at Tucker Carlson, because I believe that Tucker Carlson is not a conservative in any real marked way that I can identify. And I was pointing that out at the Heritage Foundation. How would you describe his politics? Conspiratorial populism would probably be a fair descriptor of his politics. Our colleague Jason Zengerle knew him as a young wise guy reporter who leaned maybe center-right. What happened to Tucker Carlson? I try not to speculate about people's motivations because I don't have a window into their head. All I can say is that the stuff that he has been promoting for the past several years is very much in line with the philosophies of people like Alexander Dugin, the Russian nationalist philosopher said to be close to the thinking of Vladimir Putin. Yes, Carlson's view of America in the world is a view that is actually closer to Howard Zinn than to that of traditional conservatives. This idea that America is a nefarious and terrible force in the world that has committed myriad sins and must withdraw from the world, both for its own good and for the good of the world. His belief that a conspiratorial coterie of people is manipulating American policy. Those people very often happen to have crossover with Jews, according to his guests whom he routinely launders onto the air. So, when it came to TPUSA, in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's death, Candace Owens in particular had started speculating openly that people at TPUSA, up to and including, in my interpretation, Erica Kirk, Charlie's wife, had been complicit in his murder, or at least complicit in a cover-up of his murder. Her bizarre conspiratorial rantings had been treated as legitimate and worthwhile by people ranging from Tucker Carlson to Megyn Kelly, and so I felt that it was necessary to make a speech about the gap that has emerged on the right between a conspiratorial view of politics. That sort of conspiratorialism has taken over large parts of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. Candace Owens is, I believe, somebody that you worked with at the Daily Wire. Yeah, we hired her in 2021. What did you see in her then? And then we fired her in 2023. In 2021, what we saw was a fairly mainstream conservative who said inflammatory things, and who had been telling us that she... Inflammatory things that you liked? Most of them I liked, some of them not as much. And so, as people who hired her, we thought that she was going to develop in intellectual directions. She had said that she was learning with Shelby Steele, for example, and reading the works of Thomas Sowell and this kind of thing. But by 2022, it was apparent that she was moving in another direction, and then it took until 2023 for that direction to come to full fruition. And what was the direction in 2023? By 2023, she was spouting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, among other conspiracy theories, including the idea that Emmanuel Macron's wife is actually a man, and this sort of stuff. So that was your limit with her? Well, to be fair, I am not an officer of my company. The people who made that decision were Jeremy Boring and Caleb Robinson, the co-CEOs of the company. You specifically criticized Tucker Carlson for a really soft interview he did with a guy named Nick Fuentes. who is, I think it's fair to say, a Nazi apologist. You said, if you have that person on your show and you proceed to glaze him, you ought to own it. You point out how outrageous he is, but isn't that exactly what Carlson wants in his guest? Attention? I mean, I think that the attention doesn't hurt, but at the same time, I think there is probably some ideological overlap between some of the things that he believes about America and some of the stuff that Nick Fuentes believes. Tucker has a habit of bringing on guests who spout the most conspiratorial form of a theory, and then he sort of buys it back about 5%. And then he allows those views to be predominant in the public discourse while talking about what wonderful people these folks are. I get that, and I can't help but agree with that. But then you have Donald Trump, who had dinner with Nick Fuentes. How does that affect your feeling about Donald Trump? I mean, I condemned that at the time. When it comes to his dinner with Fuentes, and I believe it was Kanye West, a good combination. Yeah, pretty awful combination. People say that I grade on a curve, but I think I grade realistically here. I'm not surprised by what President Trump does. He likes being with famous people. He very often does not know who they are. He will say bad things about them 5 minutes later. He is as inconstant as the changing wind when it comes to his feelings about people. He will like Steve Bannon until he calls him Sloppy Steven and fires him, whereupon he will welcome him back into his orbit and like him again, and so these sort of... But you're taking this too casually. He's having dinner with a Nazi apologist. I didn't take that casually. And then doesn't go off and blast him. He just kind of says, oh, I kind of didn't know who it was, and Kanye brought him along. First of all, that's bad staff work, to say the least. Terrible staff work. And it's bad behavior on the part of the President of the United States, no? I agree that it's bad behavior on the part of the President of the United States. I'm not sure what else to say about that. Part 2 continued in next video.
Thank you for watching this AGNDD and Telly Report, dear viewers. Please like, subscribe, and click the bell button to get notified during new uploads. And make sure to tune in next time. Stay safe and healthy. Cheers.